The bright CNN studio lights glared as Alan Dershowitz adjusted his thin wireframe glasses, his steady hands gripping the edge of the desk. At 85, the legendary Harvard law professor had argued before the Supreme Court, defended presidents, and authored dozens of books. He'd faced prosecutors, judges, and primetime hosts. But tonight, sitting across from him, was someone he had written off as just another new congresswoman from Texas. Jasmine Crockett, 43, wore a tailored burgundy suit that matched the determination in her eyes. Before we dive into this on-air clash that stunned viewers across the nation, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. You'll want to see why Crockett destroys Dershowitz became the top trending topic in America. The atmosphere in the studio was tense. Just before going live, Dershowitz had been caught on a hot mic saying, "Another inexperienced congresswoman looking for attention. This will be easy." He didn't realize Crockett, seated in the green room, heard every word through the monitor. She'd smiled quietly, the same composed, confident smile her staff recognized from her courtroom victories back in Texas. Anderson Cooper sat between them, his silver hair neatly styled, but even he seemed to sense the tension crackling in the air. "Professor Dershowitz," Anderson began, "you've been openly critical of Congresswoman Crockett's comments on judicial reform. Would you like to elaborate?" Dershowitz leaned forward, his tone carrying the same self-assured authority that had filled Harvard lecture halls for half a century. "Anderson," he began, "what we're seeing from Representative Crockett is exactly what's wrong with today's generation of politicians. They speak in slogans, tweet before they think, and have little understanding of constitutional law. Listening to her talk about Supreme Court reform, it's clear she hasn't read even one of my 32 books on the subject." The camera caught a subtle tilt of Crockett's head, a slight smirk forming as she let him continue. "Furthermore," he added, growing more animated, "Congresswoman Crockett represents what's gone wrong with her party. They've traded real legal minds for social media personalities. When I was defending the Constitution in the Senate, where was she? Probably making TikToks," the audience gasped. Phones lit up as people began recording, sensing this would go viral. Crockett, however, remained calm, hands folded neatly on the desk, eyes steady, the posture of a lawyer who knows her opponent is walking straight into a trap. To understand why this exchange became the most talked about political broadcast of the year, you need to know who these two figures really are. Alan Morton Dershowitz had built his entire reputation on being the smartest man in any room. Born in Brooklyn in 1938, he'd climbed from a working-class background to Harvard Law School, becoming its youngest full professor by age 28. His client list read like a who's who of controversy. O.J. Simpson, Jeffrey Epstein, Donald Trump. He'd written bestsellers, dominated news cycles, and cemented his image as America's most outspoken defense attorney. To Dershowitz, law was not just practice, it was performance, and he was always the star. Yet in recent years that confidence had been tested. His defense of Trump during impeachment had cost him friends on Martha's Vineyard, while his links to Epstein had drawn scrutiny. At 85, he was battling to prove he still belonged in a rapidly changing media world. This CNN appearance wasn't just another interview. It was his chance to reassert dominance. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, represented everything he claimed to disdain about modern politics. A Dallas native raised in a middle-class black family, she'd watched her parents work tirelessly to send her to college. Earning her law degree from the University of Houston, not an Ivy League, she'd chosen to defend ordinary citizens as a public defender and civil rights attorney, rather than chase prestige. But what Dershowitz didn't know was that Crockett had studied him for years. In law school, she'd analyzed his writings, dissected his logic, and written papers critiquing his arguments. She knew his tactics, the interruptions, the condescending tone, the self-promotion. And she also knew his weaknesses: ego, overconfidence, and sloppy assumptions when facing someone he underestimated. When Crockett won her congressional seat in 2023, succeeding the respected Eddie Bernice Johnson, many political insiders underestimated her too. They wouldn't make that mistake again. They saw her social media following, her quick wit, and her viral moments, and assumed she was just another politician performing for the cameras. What they didn't see were the long nights studying policy, the countless legal briefs she read, or the disciplined way she prepared for every hearing as if it were a courtroom trial. The stakes tonight went far beyond a simple TV debate. For Dershowitz, it was about proving that experience and pedigree still mattered, that expertise couldn't be replaced by internet popularity. For Crockett, it was about showing that this new generation of leaders was more than just tech-savvy. They were informed, prepared, and ready to challenge outdated thinking. Sensing the tension, Anderson Cooper carefully shifted the discussion. Congresswoman Crockett, you've heard Professor Dershowitz's critique. How would you like to respond? Crockett uncrossed her legs slowly, deliberately, her composure calm yet assertive. She looked directly at Dershowitz, not Cooper. And when she spoke, her tone was controlled and firm. Professor Dershowitz, thank you for that introduction. You've just illustrated exactly why your generation of legal scholars has failed this country. You're so focused on your own legacy, your books, your theories, that you've ignored the fact that the Constitution isn't protecting people anymore. While you were defending billionaires and writing opinion pieces from Martha's Vineyard, I was in Texas courtrooms watching working people get crushed by a system you helped shape. Dershowitz's face flushed. He started to respond, but Crockett raised her hand, a calm yet authoritative gesture that made him stop mid-breath. I'm not finished, Professor. You want to talk about constitutional law? Let's do that. But first, I think the American people should understand your recent legal positions. Should we begin with your claim that a president can do anything to get reelected if he believes it's in the public interest? Or maybe your shifting view of executive privilege, depending on who's in office. The studio fell completely silent. Even the camera crew paused, sensing the weight of the moment. For the first time, Dershowitz's confident demeanor faltered. His left eye twitched, a small but telling sign recognized by many of his former students. He wasn't just angry, he was caught off guard. Young lady, he began, his tone sharp with condescension. I've been practicing law since before you were born. I've argued before the Supreme Court and influenced the very structure of legal thought in this country. What have you done, besides winning a safe Democratic seat and posting tweets? Crockett laughed softly, not nervously, but with calm assurance that filled the room. There it is, young lady. Professor, I'm a 43-year-old congresswoman and a licensed attorney, not one of your students to be lectured. And since you asked what I've done, let me answer. She pulled out a folder, a real one, and placed it neatly on the desk. The move was measured, meant for both the audience and her opponent. A subtle display of preparation and confidence. While you were defending Jeffrey Epstein, I was representing trafficking victims in Texas. While you were arguing that presidents could act without accountability, I was challenging voter suppression laws in federal court. And while you were writing your 33rd book that no one asked for, I was studying the Constitution, the entire document, not just the parts that fit your client's defense. The audience couldn't stay silent any longer. Several people gasped. Someone whispered, "Oh, snap!" Phones were raised instantly, recording from every angle. Anderson Cooper tried to step in. "Let's keep this civil," he urged. But Dershowitz had already lost his composure. "How dare you bring up Epstein? I was performing my constitutional duty as an attorney. Everyone deserves representation." "Interesting," Crockett replied evenly, her tone calm as his rose. "Everyone deserves representation, but apparently not everyone deserves respect. You've spent the last 5 minutes calling me inexperienced, dismissing me as a social media personality, and now you want to lecture me on constitutional duty. Let's talk about that, Professor. Let's talk about your duty to the truth." She opened the folder and removed a document. "This is a transcript from your 1998 testimony on executive privilege. Should I read what you said then, or skip to 2019 when you said the exact opposite?" Dershowitz's hands trembled slightly. Not enough for the camera to catch, but noticeable to those in the studio. "You're taking things out of context," he protested. Crockett interrupted, something she rarely did, but this time it was intentional. "The context," she said, "is that you've spent 50 years reshaping the law to serve power, and now you're upset that someone's challenging you on it. You want to know the difference between us, Professor? You treat the Constitution as something to manipulate. I see it as a promise to uphold." The confrontation had gone further than anyone anticipated. Off camera, Cooper glanced toward the producers, unsure if they should cut to commercial, but the viewership numbers were skyrocketing. Social media was already lighting up with clips of the exchange. Trying to recover control, Dershowitz fell back on his trademark tone. Congresswoman Crockett clearly doesn't understand the nuance of constitutional interpretation. When I taught at Harvard— Oh, we're back to Harvard, Crockett interrupted, rolling her eyes in a way that was confident yet composed. Professor, do you know what the problem is with constantly mentioning Harvard? It makes you sound like someone who peaked 50 years ago and hasn't had a new idea since. You want to talk about teaching? Fine. How many of your students became public defenders? How many are working for civil rights? Or did you just train another generation of corporate lawyers who think law is about winning, not justice? The temperature in the studio seemed to rise. Dershowitz loosened his tie, a familiar gesture for those who'd seen him under pressure before. But Crockett wasn't finished. She was methodical, layering her argument like a trial attorney addressing a jury. You mention my social media presence as if it's something to be embarrassed about, she continued. But do you know what social media represents, Professor? It's democracy. It gives people a voice without needing permission from gatekeepers like you. When I talk about judicial reform online, millions of Americans engage. When you publish an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, it's locked behind a paywall most Americans can't access. So tell me, who's really speaking to the public? Dershowitz tried to interject. That's a simplistic— I'm not finished, Crockett said firmly. You've had 50 years to talk. Give me 5 minutes. She paused, then continued. Your generation of legal scholars built a system where justice can be bought, where billionaires walk free while working people serve time for the same crimes. And now you have the nerve to come on national television and lecture me about constitutional law? The Constitution begins with, "We the people, Professor," not "We the Harvard graduates." That was the turning point. Crockett reached into her folder once more and pulled out another document. The camera zoomed in just as Dershowitz recognized what she was holding, and his expression said it all. Professor Dershowitz, do you recall writing this law review article in 1976? Crockett asked, holding up the paper so the camera could focus on the title. It's called The Case for Judicial Activism in Protecting Civil Rights. An interesting read. You argued, and I quote, that the court must sometimes act beyond strict constitutional interpretation to protect vulnerable groups from systemic discrimination. Dershowitz's complexion shifted from red to pale. That was a different time, he muttered. A different time? Crockett's voice rose slightly, firm, not emotional. Civil rights were a different time? Or was it only different when you were building your reputation as a liberal icon? She glanced down at the document again. Here's another quote from Alan Dershowitz. 1976. Those who hide behind originalism and strict construction often use constitutional interpretation as a cover to maintain unjust power structures. She looked directly into the camera. That's you, Professor Dershowitz, calling out exactly what you've become. You were right in 1976. The question is, what happened to that man? The studio went silent. Anderson Cooper had stopped trying to moderate. What began as a debate had turned into something deeper, a public reckoning. You're misrepresenting my evolution as a scholar, Dershowitz stammered. Evolution? Crockett repeated, her tone sharp but measured. Is that what we're calling it when someone trades their principles for access and influence? She paused, letting the question hang. You know what I learned studying your career, Professor? That you're brilliant, truly brilliant. But somewhere along the way, you decided that being brilliant was more important than being right, that winning the argument mattered more than telling the truth. She reached into her folder again. This, she said, is a transcript from your appearance on this same network in 2008. You said, and I quote, "The greatest threat to American democracy is when legal scholars prioritize personal relationships and financial interests over constitutional principles." Do you remember saying that? Dershowitz didn't respond. He couldn't. The footage existed, and any denial would only confirm her point. For the first time in his long television career, Alan Dershowitz had nothing to say. Crockett continued, seizing the moment. The problem isn't that you changed your mind, people evolve. The problem is that your positions always seem to evolve in ways that align with whoever's funding your work, or inviting you to their events. You became everything you once warned others about. She turned toward Anderson Cooper, deliberately shifting her focus away from Dershowitz, signaling that the discussion had moved beyond him. Anderson, the American people deserve better than scholars who treat the Constitution like a menu, picking and choosing based on convenience. They deserve leaders who see the law as a tool for justice, not a game for the privileged to play. Then she delivered the line that would echo across every social platform. Professor Dershowitz wants to talk about experience. I've experienced something he never has. Being a black woman in America, navigating a legal system that wasn't built for me. I've represented clients who couldn't afford justice. I've fought for democracy while people like him tried to explain it away. So yes, Professor, let's talk about experience. But let's be honest about whose experience actually matters to the American people. The camera caught Dershowitz's expression, the precise moment he realized he'd been completely outmatched. This wasn't a young congresswoman stumbling into a lucky debate win. It was a deliberate, well-prepared dismantling by someone who had studied him, anticipated him, and exposed him on live television. He made one final attempt to regain control. "This is just grandstanding," Crockett interrupted immediately, her tone sharp but composed. "Grandstanding? Professor, you literally wrote the case against impeaching Trump while Trump was your client. You appeared on every network willing to host you to defend a man who tried to undermine democracy. And you want to accuse me of grandstanding? At least when I take a stand, I don't send an invoice afterward." The audience couldn't stay quiet any longer. Applause broke out. Someone called out, "Tell him, Congresswoman." Anderson Cooper tried to calm the room, but the energy had shifted completely. Dershowitz suddenly looked smaller, out of touch, relic-like. Crockett, on the other hand, looked like the future. But she wasn't done. In what became the most viral moment of the exchange, Crockett looked directly at Dershowitz, her voice calm but cutting. "Professor, you keep referencing your 32 books. I've read them. All of them. Even the ones that contradict each other. And here's what I learned. You're a brilliant legal mind trapped in a moral vacuum. You understand the law better than almost anyone alive, but you've forgotten why it exists. The law isn't about proving intelligence. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. Until you remember that, all your books, arguments, and Harvard credentials mean nothing." Dershowitz's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. His famous quick wit, the skill that made him a media fixture for decades, had failed him. He glanced at Anderson Cooper for help, but Cooper, like the rest of the audience, was silent, watching. Finally, Dershowitz managed to stammer, This is character assassination." "No, Professor," Crockett replied, her voice even. "Character assassination would be bringing up your visits to Jeffrey Epstein's home. Character assassination would be discussing your inconsistent accounts about that relationship. What I'm doing is holding a mirror to your public positions and asking you to explain the reflection. If you don't like what you see, that's not my problem." Then came the moment that defined the night. Crockett pulled out her phone, a move that might have seemed casual to anyone else but came across as perfectly intentional. "You know what this is, Professor?" she asked, holding it up. "This is democracy in my hand. Right now, millions of Americans are watching this conversation. They're fact-checking us both in real time. They're sharing clips, discussing ideas, engaging with democracy in ways your generation never could. You call it social media influence. I call it the marketplace of ideas you once claimed to believe in." She glanced down at her screen. "Oh, look," she said with a faint smile. "You're trending. #1 on Twitter. The hashtag is Dershowitz destroyed. #2, Asa Crockett for president. See, Professor, the people are speaking, and unlike your selective reading of the Constitution, their message couldn't be clearer." The final minutes of the segment were uncomfortable to watch for anyone still supporting Dershowitz. He tried multiple times to recover, searching for any argument that might land, but Crockett had prepared for every move. When he criticized her for lacking Supreme Court experience, she countered by pointing out that the current court held the lowest public approval rating in U.S. history. When he challenged her understanding of legal precedent, she cited 5 cases where he himself had argued against precedent when it benefited his clients. Anderson Cooper, finally regaining his composure, interjected. Professor Dershowitz, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's points regarding your evolution on executive privilege? Dershowitz, his tone barely audible, muttered, I've always been consistent in my principles. Stop, Crockett said. Calm, firm, not unkind. Professor, you're embarrassing yourself. You've contradicted your own arguments at least 12 times during this conversation. I've been keeping count. Would you like me to list them? The expression on Dershowitz's face was unlike anything his Harvard peers had ever seen. A clear, unshakable look of defeat. Not just a loss in debate, but in the entire notion of his intellectual superiority. Anderson Cooper tried to steer the discussion back to normal. We have about a minute left. Final thoughts? Crockett went first, her tone shifting from fierce to thoughtful. My final thought is this. America is at a crossroads. We can keep letting the same voices who led us into this mess tell us they're the only ones capable of fixing it. Or we can acknowledge that real wisdom doesn't only come from Ivy League halls or expensive retainers. It comes from lived experience, from fighting for justice when it isn't profitable, from standing up to power even when power controls the narrative. Professor Dershowitz represents the old way. Law as performance art for the elite. I represent something different. Law as a tool for the people. And based on tonight's response, I think the people are ready for that change. Dershowitz's final words became an instant meme. You've taken everything out of context, he said weakly. I've written 32 books. 33. Crockett corrected smoothly. You mentioned you're writing another one, although after tonight you might want to reconsider the title. The broadcast ended with a now iconic wide shot, Crockett sitting tall and composed, a faint smile on her face, while Dershowitz slumped in his chair, looking every bit his 85 years. Anderson Cooper thanked them both, but only Crockett seemed to register it. The internet exploded the moment the cameras stopped rolling. Crockett destroys Dershowitz trended #1 worldwide. The clip of her saying, "You're a brilliant, legal mind trapped in a moral vacuum," was shared over 1 million times within an hour. Memes flooded social media. Dershowitz's stunned face became the new surprised Pikachu, while Crockett's poised dismantling was remixed with dramatic soundtrack clips. But the impact stretched far beyond social media. Within hours, 3 major news networks canceled Dershowitz's upcoming appearances. Harvard law students launched a petition to remove his name from a lecture hall. Publishers Weekly reported that pre-orders for his forthcoming book had been canceled en masse. Meanwhile, Crockett's congressional office was overwhelmed with calls, emails, and donations. The Democratic National Committee, which had previously overlooked the freshman lawmaker, now wanted her featured at every major event. Networks that had never booked her before were competing for interviews. Political analysts called it the most decisive on-air takedown in television history. On CNN's late-night analysis, Van Jones summarized it best. What we witnessed tonight wasn't just a debate, it was a generational shift. Jasmine Crockett didn't just challenge Alan Dershowitz, she exposed an entire system of legal elitism that has weakened our democracy. Even conservative commentators had to acknowledge that Crockett's performance was remarkable. Ben Shapiro, typically no supporter of Democratic politicians, tweeted, "I disagree with Crockett on policy, but what she did to Dershowitz tonight was a masterclass in preparation and execution. He walked into an ambush he should have seen coming." The next morning, Dershowitz appeared on Fox News to do damage control. "She ambushed me with out-of-context quotes," he told a sympathetic host. But even on friendly ground, he couldn't escape the truth. The host asked, "But Professor, were those your words?" His vague answer became yet another viral moment. Crockett, meanwhile, handled the attention with composure. Appearing on MSNBC the next day, she was asked if she felt she had destroyed Dershowitz. Her response revealed the political poise that made her so effective. "I didn't destroy Professor Dershowitz. He did that himself, after decades of choosing power over principle. I just showed the receipts. This isn't about one man. It's about a system where legal expertise has been used to protect the powerful instead of defending justice. He's a symptom, not the disease." When asked if she felt bad about embarrassing an 85-year-old man on live television, her answer was firm. "I feel bad that an 85-year-old man with all his privilege and education used his platform to dismiss and demean younger voices, especially women and people of color." Respect is earned, not guaranteed with age. If you can't take the heat, maybe don't start the fire. The political impact was immediate. Crockett's fundraising surged. She raised more in 48 hours than in her entire previous campaign. Speaking invitations flooded in nationwide. Party leadership, recognizing her momentum, fast-tracked her committee assignments. Talk of a Senate run, even a potential presidential bid, began circulating. But beyond politics, the confrontation revealed something deeper about American discourse. For too long, credentials had been used to silence new perspectives. The assumption that Harvard meant brilliance, that experience meant wisdom, and that age meant authority. All of it crumbled in that one 30-minute exchange. Universities began studying the event. The Crockett-Dershowitz debate became shorthand for the moment when preparation defeated prestige, when substance overtook style, and a new generation announced it would no longer be talked down to. 3 days later, Dershowitz tried to reclaim the narrative with an op-ed titled "The Danger of Soundbite Politics." But the internet wasn't forgiving. Within hours, users created a compilation of his past soundbites, set to circus music. The backlash was brutal. Crockett, staying focused, announced a national tour called Justice for All, Reimagining American Law. Tickets sold out in minutes. She made sure not to center it around Dershowitz, because this was never just about him. A week later, Saturday Night Live aired a parody of the debate. The actress portraying Crockett delivered the now iconic moral vacuum line to roaring applause. The actor playing Dershowitz kept repeating, "I've written 32 books," before holding up a children's picture book titled Allen's Big Book of Constitutional Contradictions. But the true significance came from academics. Historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat published The Crockett Moment, When Democracy Punches Back. She argued that the exchange symbolized something bigger, a rejection of the intellectual elitism that had justified democratic decline. Crockett hadn't just won an argument. She had stripped away the illusion of authority built on reputation alone. 2 weeks later, Dershowitz appeared on a small podcast, the only show that would host him. He admitted, "I wasn't prepared for Congresswoman Crockett's approach, the closest he ever came to admitting defeat." When he repeated that his quotes were taken out of context, the internet responded instantly, with yet another montage, this time set to Curb Your Enthusiasm's theme. Crockett's influence spread far beyond politics. Law schools invited her to speak. Young lawyers, especially women and people of color, saw her as proof that authenticity and preparation could triumph over hierarchy. Polls showed her as one of the most recognized members of Congress, with favorable ratings across party lines. Even her critics respected her mastery. "I disagree with everything she stands for," one conservative voter said, "but you can't deny, she did her homework." The legal world took notice. Yale Law hosted a symposium titled After Dershowitz, Legal Authority in the Digital Age. Harvard quietly removed references to him from its alumni page. Meanwhile, applications to Crockett's alma mater, the University of Houston Law Center, soared. Students wore t-shirts quoting her lines. Moral vacuum became shorthand for brilliance without ethics. 32 books became slang for when someone used credentials instead of evidence. Months later, Crockett delivered the commencement address at several law schools. Her speech at Howard University stood out. "They told you to go to the right schools, know the right people, say the right things. They told you challenging power would end your career, but I've learned that the law exists to serve justice, not justify it." Speaking truth to power isn't career suicide. It's career rocket fuel. The impact on Dershowitz was severe yet transformative. Confronting his contradictions, he published a reflective book titled The Mirror of Law. Though sales were poor, critics called it his most honest work in decades. He admitted, "My certainty in my own righteousness may have blinded me to valid criticism." 6 months later, he privately reached out to Crockett to meet for coffee. She agreed on the condition it remain off the record. What they discussed stayed between them, but afterward, Dershowitz stopped criticizing her, even citing her positively in a law review piece on the evolution of legal discourse. Crockett, for her part, remained gracious. In later interviews, she said, "Professor Dershowitz is a brilliant legal mind who lost his way. I hope he finds it again. America needs brilliant minds, but more importantly, moral ones." A year later, the debate's influence was undeniable. Crockett had become one of the most powerful figures in Congress, a regular on major news shows, and a major voice in Democratic politics. Pulling a Crockett had entered the political dictionary, meaning to dismantle an opponent through preparation and precision rather than bluster. Law schools added the Crockett method to their curricula. The American Bar Association created the Crockett Award for lawyers who demonstrated ethical consistency throughout their careers. But the greatest victory was for democracy itself. The event proved that in the marketplace of ideas, the best prepared argument could still win, no matter who delivered it. It showed that authenticity, clarity, and truth could cut through privilege and pretense. Years later, historians would call it a turning point. The night when a freshman congresswoman from Texas faced a Harvard legend and won, not with theatrics, but with preparation and integrity. The night Jasmine Crockett proved that the future doesn't have to defer to the past. Sometimes David doesn't need a slingshot, just the truth. Delivered with precision. If you've made it this far, you've seen how preparation, courage, and principle can defeat even the most established power. This moment changed American politics forever, and it all began with one woman refusing to be intimidated. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another story of democracy in action. Share this video with anyone who needs to remember that standing up to power isn't impossible. It's essential. Comment below with your thoughts on this debate, because in the end, the fight for justice belongs to all of us. This was the story of how Jasmine Crockett proved that wisdom doesn't come from age or credentials. It comes from standing for what's right and fighting for it. Thank you for watching. Stay informed, stay engaged, and we'll see you in the next video, where we break down another defining moment that reshaped our political landscape.